All right, it's official. I think Og might be dead. With a post of additional class tuning and updates for patch 11.1, Augmentation Evoker and DPS Warrior nerfs. We're going to kind of go through all of these changes, kind of what they mean more towards Mythic Plus, but we'll kind of talk about Raid a little bit and just kind of what this means. But there are some pretty big class tuning passes that are hitting. This is going to affect a lot of people's like tier lists and how they feel about some of their specializations, maybe going into the patch. And we'll kind of talk about just in general what it means for your specialization. From what I've basically seen and gathered from my time playing the PTR. Blizzard states also that the following changes will arrive alongside the patch February 25th for this region, meaning that they're not actually going to be testable on the PTR. That's not necessarily true. There's some of these changes that have actually arrived early. I saw some of the changes actually were already implemented, including like Affliction Warlock was live, but like some of the stuff that might not end up being live until the patch actually hits. And so let's take a second to kind of talk through what all these changes were. First and foremost, we had DKs, both of the DK specializations getting buffed by 5%. This probably doesn't change too much in terms of the landscape of is DK good or bad. I think that in general, both the DPS specializations of DK, particularly for 5-man content, were seen as a little bit behind some of the other ones, where Unholy still has this weird situation where they have to pick between AoE and single target. Frost, I think from most people's perspective, was slightly ahead. This is going to basically, if you were playing with a DK, a DPS Death Knight, it's going to make it more competitive than it previously was. It's probably still not going to be one of these top tier DPS options, but again, it's just going to be a little bit more competitive. 5% more damage is nothing to actually scoff at. It's actually a pretty big damage increase. Demon Hunter. Eldrazi Reaver was very, very powerful for Havoc in particular, and Wounded Quarry was double dipping with their mastery and doing probably somewhere between 15 to 20% of their overall damage. It was arguably the most broken specialization in the game. The amount of funnel damage that you gained just by playing with an Eldrazi Reaver Havoc Demon Hunter meant that you would effectively kill the high health target in every single pack about the exact same time that the other mobs would die. This meant that, and Terrathal and I were kind of talking about this today, whenever we were just kind of guesstimating where specs were going to be, we had Havoc Demon Hunter in like our required tier, where we thought that this specialization was going to be absolutely nuts because of Wounded Quarry. Now, they ended up nerfing it. I don't know exactly what the numbers are going to end up being with this. I don't think it's going to end up being something that's like super insane. Maybe it ends up being about half as good as it previously was. So Havoc Demon Hunter ends up catching about 7.5 to 10% damage nerf. But ultimately, removing their niche of having this great funnel. Basically, they weren't the craziest overall DPS specialization in general, but you were going to play with them because their funnel was just so dominant. And by nerfing that heavily without any compensatory buffs, that kind of leaves Havoc Demon Hunter in this weird spot where it's a lot less good than it otherwise was. Again, this is just for Mythic Plus. For Raid, everything's a little bit different. Druid Feral. Feral is already seen as like a pretty strong specialization during the PTR. Kind of a little bit of a surprise for 5-man content in particular. They ended up buffing their damage from auto attacks, Adaptive Swarm, and their tier set. This was already a specialization that was seen as like pretty solid. Now it might end up coming up a little bit further. The fact that it avoided nerfs and ended up catching a buff is like a great thing for a specialization that was already looking pretty good. If you were planning on playing Feral, this is another just great performance. I don't think this is going to make them a required specialization by any means, but I think that this turns them into a fairly solid spec. Guardian Druid ended up catching a little bit of a buff, totally fine. Nothing really too much to talk about. Bear Druid damage is like really low. Their survivability is actually quite good, but their damage was a little bit low, so buffing their damage by any means is totally fine. Here's the big hitter. Augmentation Evoker, Shifting Sands versatility effectiveness reduced by 20%. Breath of Eons now accumulates 8% of damage taken, was previously 10%. And closest clutch mates got fucking annihilated from 25% to 10% Breath of Eons contribution with Ebb and Might outside of Raid. I was already under the impression that Aug was a little bit on the downswing, right? If you look at it in logs, there was a lot of weird attribution issues, but ultimately it looked like Aug, even with the attribution issues aside, it looked like Aug was going to be pretty low damage. Not like tank damage like you're looking at in some of these logs, but whenever you went through and actually looked at how the attribution was playing out, it looked like it was just going to be a lower specialization than it had been in the past damage-wise, which made me think that maybe Aug is going to end up being on the downswing. And it didn't look like it was going to be required next season. Blizzard has taken a sledgehammer to the specialization. Now this specialization is going to suck. Like, not only is it going to be, we thought maybe bad, now it's going to be unplayably bad. It is horrible. If you were looking to do high keys, you're now free from Aug prison. But yeah, this spec is going to suck. Like, I think this is probably going to be the worst spec in the game. This nerf is that level of insane. They ended up buffing Dev again. Not many people have been playing Dev. I know they've been buffing Firestorm patch in and patch out. I think this is something that I'm going to have to kind of talk to some people. I saw Dev was doing a decent amount less damage than, Zorthus in a key a couple of days ago. Was that Dev being bad? Was it that player being bad? There's always these kind of things. I'm kind of interested in seeing how Devastation ends up performing. This could actually be a pretty decent specialization, especially catching a few buffs in consecutive patches. I don't expect this thing to be like completely blowing any specialization out of the water, but I do expect this to be, improving. Like, we were kind of looking at this as maybe like a B or a C tier specialization. This is probably almost certainly now either a B or maybe like a low A tier specialization, especially after catching a bunch of damage buffs in a row. BM Hunter, this is probably one of the top specs in the game. I think that this nerf is largely caused by Raid. An 8% damage nerf to a spec that only brings damage in your group is a little bit tough. The BM Hunter kind of already had this issue where, you try to have to figure out like what comp BM fits into. Maybe there's some fizz damage comp with like a Mistweaver Monk, a Guardian Druid, and an Arms Warrior that BM would fit really well into. Maybe can fit into that third DPS slot even still with like a Mage plus the X, and because BM on its own individual merits does enough damage. Now with it being reduced by 8%, it makes, with their damage being less dominant, it kind of makes it harder to fit BM into a wider range of compositions just in general. But the spec was going to be good. Now I think the spec is going to be tough to find like a home for compositionally. Marksmanship, this is a spec that got reworked this patch and was doing awful damage, just horrible, and they're buffing it by 6%. I don't know if this is going to be the silver bullet fix for marksmanship, but they're trying to just, narrow the gap between top and bottom, right? That's ultimately what Blizzard's trying to do here. They're trying to make the delta between the top and the bottom specializations just less wide. By buffing marksmanship, you're certainly trying to achieve that for sure. Holy Paladin, healing done increased by 4%. All right, no notes. We're going home. Holy Paladin saved. I don't know. I don't think that big of a deal. Disc Priest ended up nerfing Disc Priest. Ended up changing Void Wraith. Not changing, but they ended up nerfing the Void Wraith and the Void Weaver. This is ultimately kind of something that we're gonna have to see like long-term effect stuff. I don't think it's something that we're necessarily going to be able to see the immediate implications of this. People were looking at Discipline Priest and Mistweaver Monk as the top two healers on the PTR by like a pretty substantial amount. Anything that kind of goes to where this can potentially change, you kind of have to take with a grain of salt. I don't think that this is immediately going to gut Discipline Priest out of the meta by any means, but I do think that, whenever you're looking at a nerf through this lens, you kind of have to be questioning, are there going to be other better options for healers? Is maybe Mistweaver going to be able to kind of take a step up? In addition to that, Shadow Priest ended up catching a 13% damage gain, and then they ended up nerfing their tier set. I'm not 100% sure what the actual number on their tier set was, but word of mouth was saying that people were speculating the number to be around the 30% damage gain. And so the fact that Blizzard nerfed their tier set substantially and then increased their damage by 13% probably ends up meaning that that was right. Now, there's a question as to what the damage difference is going to be with this. Shadow Priest was already, I would say, an okay DPS spec. It's not like great. It wasn't like a top tier DPS specialization. If this ends up yielding a damage buff and say Discipline Priest ends up getting nerfed by enough, I don't think that's going to change really the trajectory of both of these specializations. But this is one of those moments where maybe we could start to see another composition open up, especially if Shadow ends up being really good, where there's like a Shadow Priest Mistweaver comp or a Discipline Priest in like, the composite, like a Discipline Priest Mage comp. But yeah, kind of interesting. Once you figure out the numbers for these, you can kind of determine what the trajectory of these are. If this ends up being probably somewhere between like a 5 to an 8% damage buff for Shadow, I think that that's really starting the upwards trajectory for them for what their maximum AoE cap is for 5-man content. Now, I'm kind of interested in seeing how they perform in Raid, because Raid, Blizzard likes to really tune around the Raid, and Shadow Priest was looking pretty good on some of the spread cleave fights in the Raid. What does this change mean for that? Maybe this is too much and Blizzard ends up nerfing them because of it, but you never really know until you kind of wait and see what ends up happening with Race to World First in some of these specializations. Rogue, the only spec that was actually performing super well was Subtlety. They ended up increasing their damage by 10%, but then they ended up nerfing their tier. I don't know what this is going to end up yielding. I think this is one of those things that, again, you're gonna have to check the Ravenhold. You're gonna have to check like what their damage is. I kind of suspect that this is gonna be net neutral, kind of similar to wherever I'm looking at the Shadow Priest ones. I don't think that they were looking to like change how good or bad the specialization was. And ultimately, if this spec is roughly the same damage as it was, sub is going to continue to be sneaky, really, really strong. They ended up buffing Assassination by a little bit. Assassination didn't change too much from last patch, but the issue with Assassination, at least from players' perspective, was that the tier set got changed, and so now Assassination was just straight up less good than it was on the last patch, just because of that. Outlaw, not exactly a great specialization. It was pretty meh, just in general. So again, buffing it a little bit, buffing their AoE a little bit, this is totally fine. Arsham, healing increased by 4%. No notes. This is exactly what Resto Shaman needed. They need nothing more. Why mess with the perfect specialization? Affliction Warlock. Actually, pretty substantial buff. They buffed the Mike Wazowski. They buffed UA. They buffed Malefic Rapture from targets that have UA on it. This is going to ultimately be... You know, this was a spec that we were kind of thinking was like meh, probably the third best Warlock specialization. And these are pretty good buffs. I don't think it's going to end up making them OP by any means, but whenever you're looking, whenever you're taking a spec that was like seen as like pretty meh, like bottom 30 to 40%, and then giving them pretty substantial buffs, I think this spec is going to be pretty good. Definitely worth exploring a little bit more. Destro's quite solid right now. And so it's kind of difficult for AF to be OP if Destro is also OP, because you know, especially with these pure DPS, you kind of only end up picking one. You pick whichever one's the best. And so maybe it ends up being Affliction, but Destro was already quite good. So I think it's kind of like a wait and see situation. I know that these buffs ended up hitting. I know that Evade and Terrathal were kind of over the moon in terms of like how strong these buffs were going to be. I don't think it's going to make these specs OP by any means, but I do think it'll make them better. And then that leaves the Arms and the Fury nerfs. I'm a little bit surprised that they went ahead and nerfed Fury. Nobody was like super enamored with Fury. Maybe it was good in raid or like really weird specific single target situations. Nobody was like really over the moon with Fury. Arms was actually quite strong. Like you would look at crit kicks of odds. And Arms is already like a pretty good specialization, and he was doing quite high numbers on it. Like, he was competing with like BM Hunter, which ended up catching a nerf. Again, the kind of the same issue that the BM Hunter had. The reason that this didn't look like it was like a top tier specialization is because it lacked an identity in terms of what composition it would necessarily play in. Maybe it would actually play with the BM Hunter, right? And the sub rogue, something like that, where you're playing the BM Hunter, sub rogue, arms warrior, and that's the identity of the arms warrior. But now, after catching a 5% damage nerf, the value of the specialization becomes a little bit tougher. 5% isn't like the end of the world. A lot of specializations can catch a 5% damage nerf and still be quite good. But, it's not a situation where it was already like super dominant in the meta and now they catch a 5% nerf and it doesn't mean anything. This is a spec that was like marginally pretty good. I still think, kind of similar to the BM Hunter, what is the identity of the specialization going to look like for compositions? The spec, because here's the thing. I think a lot of people are going to end up playing around the mage. I think that both Fire and Frost are crazy right now. So I think that's what most people are going to tend to play towards, is like a Fire Mage composition. Something with like an Ellie Shaman, something with like maybe, one of the Warlock specializations, something potentially like a Moonkin. I think Feral Druid's actually a great pick here now that they ended up getting buffed. So maybe not even Moonkin, probably like Feral. But especially with Augmentation Evoker out of that, I think you're going to play more around that Mage. But like, hopefully, and this is my hopes, especially whenever AUG becomes no longer mandatory, that really opens up the possibility of a lot more diverse like compositions, right? Augmentation kind of really limited what the scope of like a large variety of comps could actually be played, because you had to start with like the most overpowered specialization on the patch, and then you had to start with the Aug Evoker, right? And so then that kind of left this weird situation where you weren't really able to play a bunch of variety of stuff. Even if the specs were good, it was like really hard to build a unique raid comp because 2 slots were locked down. And now without augmentation being locked down, this is really going to open up the doors, I think, for seeing more diverse compositions. And I'm excited. I was already on that hopium for season 2. I thought we were going to see a lot of different comps. I was thinking potentially some Augless comps even without this nerf, And now with all these changes that we're seeing today, hopefully things don't get blown up with 11.1.5. Of course, you're going to have to wait and see what the meta transforms into as time goes on, but this looks solid. And I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.